We don't serve your type here." The words sliced through the elegant atmosphere of Manhattan's most exclusive rooftop restaurant like a knife through silk. James Chen, still in his taxi driver's uniform, clutched the golden envelope in his weathered hands, his invitation to receive an award for saving a passenger's life. The crystal chandeliers above seemed to mock him, their light reflecting off the host's golden name tag and perfectly pressed suit. Around them, the city's elite paused mid-conversation, wine glasses hovering between tables and lips, as the night's unexpected drama began to unfold. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, New York City sparkled 60 stories below, as oblivious to the unfolding scene as the Michelin stars adorning the restaurant's entrance. The host's voice carried across the marble floors, bouncing off crystal and china, reaching every corner of the room. At a corner table, a distinguished figure in an expertly tailored suit lowered his menu, his attention caught by the quiet dignity in James's stance, a familiar dignity he'd seen in his father's eyes decades ago. Denzel Washington watched, his expression unreadable, as the host continued his practiced dismissal. The envelope in James's hands trembled slightly, not from fear or shame, but from the same steady determination that had made him risk his life to pull a stranger from a burning car 3 weeks ago. The same courage that had earned him this invitation now kept him standing straight, even as whispers rippled through the dining room like wind through expensive silk. He didn't notice the actor's chair sliding back, didn't see the approaching footsteps that would transform this moment of humiliation into something entirely unexpected. The restaurant's host, Michael Durant, wore his authority like his tailored suit, with practiced precision and carefully maintained superiority. His manicured hand gestured dismissively at James's work uniform, the blue collar stark against the sea of designer labels and evening wear surrounding them. "Sir, this is Le Ciel Bleu. We have a strict dress code, and I'm afraid—" His eyes flickered to the grease stain on James's sleeve from his last fare of the day. "You simply don't meet our standards. Perhaps there's been some mistake?" The word mistake hung in the air like expensive cigar smoke. James's fingers traced the embossed lettering on the envelope. New York City Transportation Hero Award Ceremony, remembering the heat of the flames, the screams, the weight of the unconscious passenger as he dragged her to safety. The dashboard camera footage had gone viral, a taxi driver risking his life without hesitation, while the Mercedes and BMWs had sped past the burning wreckage. Now those same luxury cars gleamed in the parking lot below, their owners sipping champagne at tables he apparently wasn't worthy to approach. "I have an invitation," James said quietly, extending the envelope. His voice carried the same steady calm that had guided hundreds of passengers safely through New York's chaos. Around them, conversations dwindled as diners turned to watch, their expressions a gallery of discomfort, curiosity, and barely concealed disdain. A woman in diamonds worth more than James's yearly income whispered something to her companion, hiding her smirk behind a perfectly manicured hand. Durant barely glanced at the envelope. "Anyone can print something that looks official," he said, each word dripping with practiced condescension. "We're hosting a private award ceremony for distinguished members of our community. Surely you understand that security is a concern." His eyes swept meaningfully over James's weathered face, the shadows under his eyes from his double shift still visible. At a nearby table, a group of executives chuckled, the sound carrying across the marble floors like scattered glass. One of them, his Rolex catching the light, stage whispered, "Perhaps he can wait with the other drivers in the parking garage where they belong." Denzel Washington's hand tightened imperceptibly around his water glass. The city lights blurred slightly as James blinked, fighting back emotions he refused to show. The woman he'd saved had been wearing a dress that cost more than his taxi, but in that burning moment, social status had meant nothing. He'd seen only another human being in desperate need. Now, standing in this temple of wealth, he felt the weight of every social barrier money could build. "Sir," Durant's voice hardened, his patience wearing thin, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We can call security if you need assistance." His hand moved toward the sleek phone at his podium, the threat clear in every measured movement. The dining room had fallen completely silent now, the only sounds the gentle clink of crystal and the soft whisper of the ventilation system. Some guests stared openly, others studied their plates with sudden intense interest, all of them complicit in their silence. A young waitress paused mid-step, a tray of champagne trembling slightly in her hands, her eyes darting between James and Durant. In the corner, Denzel Washington carefully folded his napkin and placed it beside his plate. His chair scraped against the marble floor, the sound sharp and decisive in the artificial quiet. He'd seen enough. Denzel Washington's footsteps echoed across the marble floor, each deliberate step carrying the weight of decades in Hollywood, of countless roles playing men of principle, of real-life moments where fiction and reality merged in the pursuit of justice. The other diners recognized him instantly. How could they not? His presence had been a subtle murmur of excitement all evening, the kind of celebrity sighting that made Le Ciel Bleu the elite establishment it claimed to be. But now that presence transformed into something else entirely. I couldn't help but overhear his voice carried the same commanding tone that had earned him 2 Academy Awards, yet held something deeper, a controlled anger that made Durant's practiced smile falter. "You're concerned about having the right kind of people in your establishment?" The host's expression flickered between starstruck awe and professional concern. "Mr. Washington, we simply have certain standards." "Standards," Denzel repeated the word, letting it hang in the air like a judge's gavel. He turned to James, and his entire demeanor shifted, softened. "Sir, may I see that invitation?" The respect in his voice was pointed, deliberate, a masterclass in dignity that made Durant's previous condescension seem even more petty. James handed over the envelope, his movement steady despite the surreal turn of events. Denzel opened it carefully, read its contents with the focused attention of someone who understood the weight of moments like these. Around them, phones had begun to emerge from pockets and purses, their cameras capturing what everyone somehow knew would become more than just another celebrity encounter. 3 weeks ago, Denzel's voice carried across the now silent restaurant. While some of us were probably arguing about wine pairings or complaining about traffic, this man pulled a stranger from a burning vehicle. He held up the invitation, its gold lettering catching the light. The woman he saved, one of your distinguished community members, would have died within minutes if he hadn't risked his life. The explosion that followed destroyed his taxi, his only source of income. Durant's complexion had taken on an interesting shade of gray. At nearby tables, several guests shifted uncomfortably, including the man who'd made the parking garage comment. His Rolex didn't shine quite so proudly now. "But that's not even the remarkable part," Denzel continued, his voice taking on the quiet intensity that had captivated audiences for decades. When interviewed afterward, Mr. Chen here refused to accept any praise, said he just did what anyone would do. He turned to address the room directly. Though apparently that's not true, is it? Because plenty of people drove right past that accident, people in very expensive cars, with very expensive clothes, who probably had reservations at very expensive restaurants. The young waitress with the champagne tray had stopped completely now, transfixed. A few tables over, an older gentleman in a bespoke suit slowly removed his glasses, a look of deep shame crossing his features. He'd been one of those who'd driven past the accident, a detail that would emerge in social media comments later that evening. Durant gripped his podium like a shield, his professional veneer cracking under the weight of mounting public scrutiny. "Mr. Washington, please understand, we have protocols." "Protocols?" Denzel's laugh held no humor. "Let me tell you about protocols. My father was a preacher who worked 2 jobs to put food on our table. He wore second-hand suits but carried himself with more dignity than I've seen in most Hollywood galas." He gestured around the opulent room. "All this? The crystal, the views, the $1,000 bottles of wine, they're just things. But courage, character, the willingness to risk everything to save a stranger, that's real value." The woman with the diamonds had set down her wine glass, her hand trembling slightly. Her companion, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, according to tomorrow's viral posts, stared at his own reflection in the window, seeing perhaps for the first time how far he'd drifted from the values his own working-class parents had instilled. James stood quietly through it all, his posture unchanged, his dignity intact. The same quiet strength that had made him stop his taxi that night while others sped past now kept him grounded in this moment of surreal intensity. His eyes met Denzel's briefly, a look of mutual recognition, of shared understanding about what really defined a person's worth. "So," Denzel turned back to Durant, his voice carrying an authority that no amount of expensive suits or prestigious positions could match, "should we discuss your protocols again? Or should we celebrate a genuine hero?" The silence that followed Denzel's question felt electric, charged with the potential for transformation. Durant's mouth opened and closed, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension, strong, female, and slightly tremulous with emotion. "He saved my life." All heads turned toward the restaurant's entrance, where a woman stood in an elegant evening gown, her neck still bearing the faint traces of bruises from the crash. Sarah Montgomery, daughter of one of New York's most prominent real estate developers, walked slowly into the room. Her heels clicked against the marble floor like a metronome counting the seconds of Durant's undoing. "I was supposed to present his award tonight," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I insisted on it, because when that truck hit my car, when the flames started—" She paused, composing herself. "Everyone else drove by. I saw their faces through my window, saw them look away, saw them speed up. But Mr. Chen? He didn't hesitate. He didn't see my designer dress or my family name. He just saw someone who needed help." The young waitress with the champagne tray had tears streaming down her face now. The man with the Rolex was staring into his lap, his earlier mockery sitting like poison in his stomach. Phones continued recording, capturing what would soon become a viral meditation on courage, class, and the true meaning of dignity. Denzel stepped aside, giving Sarah a clear path to James. The motion was deliberate, theatrical in its grace. A Hollywood legend willingly becoming a supporting actor in a moment of genuine human drama. Sarah reached James, her composed socialite's facade cracking as she took his weathered hands in hers. "I never got to properly thank you," she said, her voice carrying in the hushed room. "I was unconscious when you pulled me out, and then in the hospital." She squeezed his hands tighter. "The doctor said I had less than 2 minutes before the fire reached the fuel line, 2 minutes between life and death, and you were the only one who stopped." Durant had backed away from his podium, his authority evaporating like morning mist under a harsh sun. Denzel moved to stand beside James, his presence both protective and validating. The contrast between the taxi driver's humble uniform and the actor's bespoke suit had ceased to matter. They were simply 2 men standing in the light of authentic humanity. "The award ceremony was supposed to start with dinner," Sarah continued, turning to address the room. Her voice took on the commanding tone of someone used to being heard in corporate boardrooms. "But I think we should begin now, because everyone here needs to witness this. Everyone here needs to remember what real courage looks like." The room had begun to transform. Chairs scraped against marble as people stood. The older gentleman who had driven past the accident was the first to start clapping. The sound spread like waves across water, building into something powerful and genuine. The young waitress, tears still on her cheeks, had set down her tray and joined the applause. Even some of those who had smirked earlier found themselves caught up in the moment, their cynicism cracking under the weight of undeniable truth. Denzel stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of both his Hollywood gravitas and genuine human emotion. "I've played heroes in movies for decades," he said, addressing not just the room, but the phones still recording, ensuring his words would reach far beyond these walls. But real heroism? That's not about special effects or dramatic speeches. It's about that moment when everyone else looks away and one person chooses to look closer, when everyone else drives past and one person stops. He turned to James, speaking directly to him now. "You lost your taxi that night, your livelihood, but you never once mentioned that in any interview, never asked for anything in return. That's not just heroism, that's dignity, real dignity, the kind you can't buy with any amount of money or status." Durant had retreated to the shadows near the kitchen door, but Sarah was already moving past him, retrieving something from a side table. She returned with a crystal award and a sealed envelope. "The award was supposed to come with a small token of appreciation," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "But my father and I discussed it, and we decided—" She handed James the envelope. "This covers the cost of a new taxi, plus enough to make up for all the lost income while you waited for insurance." James began to protest, but Sarah held up her hand. "Please," she said, "let us show that this room, this city, still knows the difference between price and value." She turned to address the gathered crowd, her gaze sweeping across designer dresses and expensive suits. "Let us prove that we understand what really makes someone belong in any room they choose to enter." The transformation of Le Ciel Bleu was complete. Where there had been rigid social barriers moments before, now there was movement, life, humanity breaking through the carefully maintained veneer of exclusivity. The man with the Rolex had risen from his seat, approaching James with an outstretched hand and tears in his eyes. "My father was a cab driver in Chicago," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I forgot. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what that meant." Waiters had begun circulating with champagne, but now they offered it to everyone equally, including the young waitress who had stopped to watch. Durant had disappeared entirely, though rumors would later surface that he spent the next hour in the wine cellar, reevaluating his life choices. Phones continued recording, but their purpose had shifted, no longer capturing scandal, but instead documenting redemption. Denzel watched it all with quiet satisfaction, noting how the city's elite were now gravitating toward James, not out of social obligation, but genuine respect. The view of Manhattan through the windows seemed different somehow. The lights below no longer a reminder of social hierarchy, but of countless untold stories of everyday heroism. By midnight, the video had already gone viral. Virginia Real Hero and Denzel Moment were trending across social media, but it was the comments that told the real story. Service workers shared their own experiences of discrimination. Children of immigrants spoke about their parents' dignity in the face of prejudice. Celebrities began sharing stories of their own humble beginnings, their own parents who had driven cabs, cleaned houses, worked multiple jobs. Sarah's father, watching the video in his penthouse office, made 2 calls, one to permanently revoke Durant's employment and another to establish a scholarship fund for taxi drivers' children pursuing education. The young waitress, who had witnessed it all, posted a simple message that would be shared millions of times. "I saw real class tonight, and it had nothing to do with money." James's story was becoming something larger than himself, a mirror held up to society's prejudices and pretensions. Denzel, who had seen his share of Hollywood endings, recognized that this one was different. This wasn't scripted redemption. It was genuine human transformation, playing out in real time, rippling outward through the city's social fabric like waves through still water. Later that night, as the city's lights painted the streets in gold and shadow, James Chen pulled his borrowed taxi up to a familiar corner. Denzel, who had insisted on taking one last ride, sat in the back, both men comfortable in the quiet that often follows moments of profound truth. "You know," Denzel finally said, "in my movies, we usually have to shoot scenes like that 10, 20 times to get them right." He smiled, meeting James's eyes in the rearview mirror. "But you? You got it right the first time. Both times. At the accident and tonight." James adjusted his mirror, his new award visible in his passenger seat, catching the passing lights. "My father told me something when I first started driving," he replied softly. He said, "A taxi is just a car, but a driver? A driver can be anyone's guardian angel." He paused, then added with quiet certainty, "We're all just people trying to get home safe." As James pulled away from Denzel's hotel, his tail lights disappearing into the flow of New York traffic, he became once again one of millions, invisible perhaps to the city's elite, but carrying within him the kind of wealth that no restaurant could ever deny, no status could ever match.